9 experienced campers set up their tents in the Ural Mountains, in an area known as Dead Mountain. Something or someone awakens them in the night, terrifying them to the point that they cut open their tent with knives and flee into the snow. Some are in their underwear and socks, and some have bare feet. The temperature was at least 30 Celsius. When they make it to the tree line of a nearby forest, they scatter. A search party was organized on February 20 when an expected telegram from the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov, never arrived. The battered tent still had the group's supplies, clothing, and boots inside. Searchers were able to follow a clear path of 9 pairs of footsteps heading single file to the forest. The first bodies were found on February 26. Yuri, Georgy, Alexeyevich Krivonishenko, 24, and Yuri Nikolaevich Doroshenko, 21, were found beside the remains of a fire, shoeless and poorly dressed. Doroshenko was in a vest, short-sleeved shirt, and shorts over pants. The pants were badly torn. Doroshenko's hair was burned on the right side of his head. His ears, nose, and lips were covered in blood, and his right armpit was bruised. On the inner surface of the right shoulder were 2 abrasions with no bleeding in the tissues, and 2 cuts on the skin. On the upper third of his right forearm were several brown-red bruises. The fingers on both hands had torn skin, possibly from climbing a tree. One of the trees above the men had broken branches 15 feet up, and traces of bark were embedded in their skin. The upper third of Doroshenko's legs were bruised. He had frostbite on his face and ears, and on his right cheek there were foamy gray discharges from his mouth. Krivonishenko also had extensive bruising on his forehead, around the left temporal bone, the right side of his chest, his buttocks, his left leg, and on his hands. There were plenty of abrasions as well. The tip of his nose was missing, he had frostbitten ears, and perhaps most disturbing, some of the skin from his left hand was detached, and skin from his right hand was found in his mouth. He suffered diffuse bleeding in the right temporal and occipital region due to damage to the temporalis muscle. His left leg was burned. The bodies of 3 more campers were discovered between the forest and the tent. They looked as if they'd been trying to reach their camp in single file when they died. Dyatlov, 23, Zinaida Alexeyevna Kolmogorova, 22, and Rustam Vladimirovich Slobodin, 23, also had numerous bruises and abrasions, but were better dressed than the men found under the tree. Interestingly, Dyatlov and Vladimirovich both had bruises in the metacarpophalangeal joints on both hands, which is common in hand-to-hand combat. Dyatlov was missing a tooth. He had bloody lips, while Vladimirovich had blood coming from his nose. It took searchers more than 2 months to find the remaining 4 campers. They were discovered on May 4 under 4 meters of snow in a ravine 75 meters farther into the woods from the cedar tree. These 4 were better dressed than the others, and there were signs that they had taken clothing from the friends who had died earlier. These bodies had the most disturbing injuries. Alexander Kolevatov, 25, had a broken nose, an open wound behind his ear, and a deformed neck. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, 25, had multiple fractures to the temporal bone of the skull, with extensions to the frontal and sphenoid bones, a bruise on the upper lip on the left side, and a large hemorrhage on the lower forearm. The eyes of Semyon Zolotarev, 38, were missing. The bones on his skull were exposed, and he had a flail chest with 5 ribs broken and 2 fractures. He also had an open wound on the right side of his skull with exposed bone. But Lyudmila Dubinina, 21, one of the 2 women in the group, probably suffered the most. Horrifyingly, her tongue and the muscles on the floor of her mouth were removed. The amount of blood in her stomach suggested this was done while she was still alive. Her eyes were missing, her nose cartilages were broken and flattened, 4 ribs were broken on the right side and 7 on the left side. She suffered a massive hemorrhage in the heart's right atrium. Her left thigh was bruised, and she had damaged tissues around the left temporal bone. Zolotarev and Dubinina's injuries were very similar in direction and force, despite their differences in shape, height, and body composition. This would suggest that whatever caused these injuries was not a single event. The medical examiner excluded accidental fall on the rock as a possible cause for such massive and unusual fractures. The last 4 bodies were crushed with immense force and had all suffered significant damage to their bones. Doctors compared the extent of the damage to being hit by a car. While there was a criminal investigation into the incident, Russian authorities eventually ruled that the deaths were due to a compelling natural force and closed the case. The records were sealed, and no one was allowed near the site for 3 years, which only heightened the mystery, as did the levels of radiation that were found on some of the victims' clothes. Another strange aspect of the case is the high level of decomposition of some of the bodies, but not others. Due to the below freezing temperatures, decomposition should have been minimal.